I had the extreme pleasure to talk to Sifu John Kaufman on Zoom. He's over in Hong Kong, and the conversation lasted hours and hours. So I decided that I would break it up into shorter videos. This first part is about the life and the teachings of Chu Shong Tin, the development of that methodology of Wing Chun. I have to say that I found a lot of this conversation very uplifting and enlightening, and it helped me put together things that I didn't understand about where my power is coming from, and that perhaps I'm a lot closer than I thought. So it was very uplifting discussion for me. John is on YouTube. Please look him up and subscribe to his channel. He's a very approachable, nice guy. Leave a comment and let him know that his teachings matter. I felt that I wanted to record some of this conversation. I felt was really between us, but instead I kept it, I recorded it, and he said, okay, use it, because maybe this will help other people in their Wing Chun. But also, I think that people like John, I'd like to get them on the record, right? So that people will know for a long time to come more than just what he might say in a 20-minute video, or, so this gets deeper into things. And I think that's why this is going to be a very good video series. I'm really looking forward to talking to him again. In editing these videos and watching them again and then putting them on my YouTube, it means they don't take up space on my computer anymore. It means that I can watch them from anywhere. It means that they're there for me for all time. And the process of editing them means I get to scrutinize every sentence he says. So it's a great way for me to learn. So without much more ado, here's Sifu John Kaufman. I guess what I'd like to ask you about, first of all, is Chu Shong Tin and, him, the man, his lineage, how he became what he is, where he learned from, the story of Chu Shong Tin.
I don't have any special knowledge about him other than my own, what I know and my own experience. I was introduced to the Chu Shong Tin, call it a lineage, if you will, method of Wing Chun, whatever. In 1998, when I met Marty Anderson at the opening of the Wing Chun Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Marty had trained with Chu Shong Tin from 1970 to 1980 in Hong Kong, and was Chu Shong Tin's first non-Chinese student. And when he began in 1970, Ip Man was still alive because he died in 72. And so Chu Shong Tin had to go to Ip Man and ask permission if he could teach Marty, because Marty was Guai Lo, white devil. And of course, I don't know what the conversation was. I have a sense of humor about this stuff, so I'm guessing it was probably something as simple as, hey, is the guy going to pay you? I guess so. Well, go ahead then, And anyway, Marty would go to Hong Kong and train for that 10-year period. And when I met him and spent some time with him that weekend in Ohio at the opening of the museum, he had been out of Wing Chun for 18 years, since 1980. But he lived in Duluth, Minnesota. Hadn't left Duluth in 18 years, but he came to Ohio because he wanted to say hello to his old Sifu, Chu Shong Tin. And he knew he was going to be there, one of the people that would be coming from Asia to be there at the opening of the museum. So anyway, I met Marty there, and we spent a lot of time together that weekend, touched hands with him, and I'd never met anybody that could do what he could do. I was just blown away by his abilities. And he said to me, if you think I have anything, he said, you should see Chu Shong Tin. And so that's how I got introduced to that methodology of Wing Chun. And ever since then, that's the method that I've been training in and teaching since then. There's nothing I can say about Chu Shong Tin or his history that isn't readily available to the public online by just doing some Google search or reading people in his lineage and what they have to say about him and his experiences. And there's been some published things. He never put himself out there in the public very much. He wasn't one of those guys that was interested in making a lot of money. He didn't make a lot of videos or or run around the world, you know, starting associations and becoming famous like some other people like William Chung or Leong Ting, just a couple of examples. Um, but within the Ip Man lineage, he was very well known and very well respected for his abilities. And so, anyway, what I'm going to tell you is nothing special. It's just information that's out there. He was raised in Guangdong province in southern China. Chu Shong Tin was. That's where Ip Man came from. And he moved to Hong Kong like many people did back then in the late 40s, early 50s, especially after the communist takeover of China. He was working as a secretary in the Restaurant Workers Union in Kowloon, and that's where Ip Man was starting to teach Wing Chun, having been afforded an opportunity to do that there by Long Shong, who was Ip Man's first Wing Chun student in Hong Kong. And so Chu Shong Tin was around, and he would observe the classes, and he got interested. And long story short, he started training with Ip Man in I think it was January 51, something like that. And he was always, his own personal background before that in martial arts was very limited. His father made him take some Tai Chi lessons when he was younger, but he said that he never really cared for it and wasn't serious about it. A lot of people, especially in the last 20, 30 years, have suggested that, oh, Chu Shong Tin's Wing Chun is what it is because of his Tai Chi influence. And that's just not true, okay? He was never great at Tai Chi. He was never into it. He never spent a lot of time or was disciplined about it. The only martial art he's ever learned or trained in is Wing Chun.
It's sort of like how I had to take piano lessons but didn't care.
Yeah.
And then later on, I became a musician despite that experience.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. So, again, all of this is just, what he would say about his own background when asked, or in the very few publications that he's been involved in, he mentions this history. I can get into more detail, but I'll just start skipping around a little bit. So he started training with Ip Man, and he was very studious from the very beginning. He said that when he began, Ip Man told him, something to the effect that, young man, if you want to get good, do this. And by this, he specified, stand up straight, do Sunam Tao, the first form of Wing Chun, and use no effort, no strength. So unlike some other students, Chu Shong Tin made a conscious decision to follow his teacher's instructions religiously. And he said that for 2 years, he did his best to follow those instructions. He just did Sunam Tao, nothing else. And he did it hours every day because he wanted to learn, and he was very disciplined. He was always very disciplined. So he would be conscious of keeping an erect spine, relaxing, and performing the motions of the form, trying not to use any undue muscular tension or strength or effort. He said he just kept doing that over and over, hours every day, where other students were doing other things because maybe they didn't want to just do that or have the patience, or they wanted to do chi sao or do some of the more fun stuff or advance through the system faster. In any event, that's what he did. He said after a while of doing that, and he didn't specify as far as I know how long, he started to feel something, and it felt good. Now, he didn't, to my knowledge anyway, and it could be that he did, I just don't know about it, specify what it is that he felt. But I'm presuming that what it was he felt, whatever you want to call it, his chi moving, internal circulation, an opening up, an expansion, a connection within the body. It's kind of like oftentimes, I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but to me, in my experience, it's close enough that I use it as an analogy. Um, you know what it is to have the chills, goosebumps. Maybe you're listening to a song or watching a movie and just something overtakes you and you get the chills, right?
Yeah, it runs
Well,
right
that,
through you.
yeah, it runs through you and it's universal, meaning everywhere in your body at the same time. You don't get the chills just in your left arm or your right leg. It's everywhere, right? And it has nothing to do with external movement. External movement, what I mean by external movement is if you can see it move, it's external by definition. If there's movement happening that you cannot see, it's internal by definition. That's all. That's the only difference. Okay. So the chills have nothing to do with external motion. It's a very strong internal circulation everywhere in your body at the same time. And maybe he was feeling something akin to that. Okay. Anyway, he said it gave him an incentive or motivation to continue training that way because he was having this experience that he liked and that he felt was pretty cool, I guess. Okay. So then with other students in the Ip Man school, he said he started to try to test it out by touching hands, Chisang, with other students. And at first he couldn't make it work. He would be getting hit or beat up or whatever. But he just kept at it. He just kept at that method of doing his form work. And he said that it got to the point where nobody could touch him. That he had all this power and the students couldn't do anything against him. They would say to him, what are you doing? To have this kind of power. And he would say, I don't know. I'm just doing what Ip Man told me to do. Okay. So he didn't really have an understanding of what was happening or why it was happening, but he just kept at it. So the point I'm trying to emphasize is simply this. He always kept at the forefront of his priorities the basic instructions of Ip Man to keep an erect spine and to use no strength or effort in his movements. So when he would learn another form or particular motions of the forms, and this is all the way through the entire system, his method of training it was to take like one or two movements from a form and make sure, at least to the extent he was capable of, applying those underlying basic principles of an erect spine and use no effort in movement, relax, make that the most important thing he was doing as he was performing the forms and every movement in every form. And he wouldn't go on to another movement in a form until he felt he could do that sufficiently. That being, keep those underlying principles intact as he did that particular motion. And he would test it against resistance. Somebody would try to resist him doing that motion. And he would try to keep those principles intact as he did that particular motion. And he would see the result, which would typically be he could move people effortlessly and they couldn't stop his motion. And that's how he learned the entire system. That's the method he used to learn the entire system. And it took him years. I mean, he wrote things like, oh, from this date to this date, and it's like a 2-year span. I learned like the first 5 motions of the wooden man form. Okay. Where you and I might learn like a form in a month. Okay. But because he used that method of learning and nobody made him do that, he had the discipline to believe that this was proper, and his experience was reinforcing that conclusion. That's why he would take his time in his development. Before he passed away, I know this has been stated many times, so I believe that it's accurate. It's not just hyperbole. Everybody likes to talk about their teachers as being so great and everything else. And there's no shortage of stories floating out there, whoever your teacher is, about how great they are, et cetera, et cetera. But but I do believe this isn't just a story. I think this is true. I wasn't around back then in person to witness it. I was alive, but I wasn't in Hong Kong, so I don't know for personally. But that man gave an interview to a Hong Kong paper where he stated that Chu Shong Tin's skill exceeded his own. And he never said that, as far as I know, about any other student. So anyway, be that as it may, and so Chu Shong Tin, that formed the basis of his teaching in all the decades that he taught. He started teaching for Ip Man. He was probably Ip Man's main teacher in the school. Ip Man had him teach students in the school, and he did that for years. And then he opened his own school in Kowloon. In I don't know. I think it was probably the late 50s or definitely by the early 60s, if not before. And that's all he's done for his whole life until he died about whatever it's been now, 8 years ago, I think, when he was like 80, 81, he passed away. But that's all he did his whole life was teach Wing Chun. But the world in general didn't know much about him because, as I said, he didn't really care about it. And it wasn't until he got a lot older that students would make some short videos of him and put it on YouTube, or, he was asked to go through the system one time and they made a video of it and then they marketed that, but it's not widely marketed. This was back in like the early 2000s. And he did write a book decades ago, but it was in Cantonese. And so, unless you were Chinese, you couldn't read it. But then about, I don't know, whatever, 10, 15 years ago, it was republished with an English translation. So it was in both Chinese and English. And there's 2 volumes. So that's out there. And what happened was he started to get a larger following because in the from 2008 on, a lot of young guys from Australia started coming to Hong Kong to train with him. They had been students in the Jim Fung School of Wing Chun, Jim Fung having been a student of Chu Shong Tin in Hong Kong before he moved to Australia to go to university and started he was an accountant, but he also started to teach Wing Chun. There's a lot of Chinese guys would do that all over the world, right? I mean, there's no shortage of Wing Chun Sifus all over the world in the West that have taught Wing Chun. They move someplace like Canada or the US or Europe as young men, maybe to go to university or whatever. The Chinese move all over the world to improve their chances of success.
Well, here in Barkerville, like we have a historic gold rush town just up the road about 8 kilometers, and it has its own Chinatown within it. It's a historic site, right? It's preserved.
Yeah.
And within it, there's a Chinatown even, right? So in the 1860s here, with the gold rush, and then again with the railroads, British Columbia has had a lot of Chinese exchange, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Chinese, they're everywhere in the world, and they're large populations, and every place has a Chinatown, which is interesting because unlike some other cultures where, like, from Eastern Europe, they might move to New York City, in the early 1900s or whatever, and they might be living in like Jewish ghettos or whatever, or Irish ghettos, but they maintain their culture, but they assimilate it into the U.S. culture. Where the Chinese people, they move someplace and they live in Chinatown and they keep their own culture, and it's sort of separate from the rest of the culture, right?
Yep.
But anyway, the point I'm making is simply that there was no shortage of young men that would move around different places in the world, and they would start teaching a martial art, regardless of the style, because there's nobody to tell them not to do it, and there's no need to prove their legitimacy of their background or their knowledge. And it was a way to make money and to gain face, reputation. And so a lot of people did it regardless of what in reality, their qualifications might have been. Some of them, I'm sure, were very well qualified. And their students were lucky to learn from them, and others less so. I mean, that's just the way of the world. And it's, of course, I'm sure we're all well aware that it's the same now. even more so now. Anybody can open a school. There's no requirement that you be certified or do anything in particular. Um, and so anybody can open and offer lessons and make money and market themselves. Um, and there's no way to independently verify um, how legitimate their offerings are, other than through word of mouth, speaking to their students, touching hands with people, and finding out for yourself what they really have or don't have. Um, so in any event, Chu Shong Tin spent his whole life teaching and um, staying true to the essence of his methodology. Although his teaching changed, and he um, described this himself more than once. His teaching methods changed like 3 or 4 times over the decades of his teaching, because he said that, look, when we get to my personal history, you'll hear, but I've been involved in this lineage since 1998, and I've been coming to Hong Kong since 1999, and I've lived here, spent quite a bit of time here before I moved here permanently, which was 11 years ago. And so I've met a lot of Wing Chun people from all over the world and touched hands with them. And I've met so many of the Wing Chun people in the Chu Shong Tin lineage here in Hong Kong, and also people from New Zealand and Australia who come to Hong Kong to train, and from other places. So I know from my own personal experience that there are many, not all by any means, certainly not. It's the same in any place you go. I mean, not everybody's going to get really good, right? I mean, the percentage of people who get really good at any particular activity are always going to be fairly small, right? But there are plenty of Chu Shong Tin students who were very good. Let me just say that. But if you were to ask any of them, and I mean any, there's not a single exception that I'm aware of. Even the best people he's ever trained in his whole life, people that are great, they would all tell you their skill can't compare to his. So he never understood, he said, why his students couldn't do what he could do. And he wanted them to be able to, because he was a legitimate teacher and he cared about his students, and he wanted people to get good because he had such great respect for Wing Chun in general and for his methodology. He said he never understood why they couldn't do what he could do. He would teach them as best he could. He would tell them, stand up straight, relax, use no force, blah, 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 blah. Let your joints rotate naturally, use your center, blah, 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 whatever, And, some people got it better than others, no question, but and it's always a function of how long they train, how diligently they train, how disciplined they are, and their own personal abilities, of course, like any other activity. But none of them ever came close to being able to do what he could do. And somebody like Marty, who I know from my own personal experience with him, is really, really good. And by that, I mean, I started to Chi with him, and I thought I was pretty good at what I did back then.
And he's just jerking you around, eh?
Yeah, I couldn't touch him. Any little motion he made, he's just throwing me around like a rag doll. I never had that experience before in my life. And so I mean, I do believe, and I kind of know that Marty was, one of Chu Shong Tin's best students. And let me put it this way. I met a lot of Chu Shong Tin's better students. And I don't remember meeting anybody that I thought was like a lot better than Marty. Okay. So when I say Marty's good, I really mean it. And Marty would tell me, hey, he's nothing compared to Chu Shong Tin. And Marty doesn't have false humility. Okay. And we're talking about someone who was a fighter. Okay. I mean, Marty was a real fighter. He liked to fight. And he was a former special forces soldier in Vietnam. And the guy had a background, and he worked in like bars and stuff as security and bouncers in northern Minnesota in Duluth, where that's Viking stock, where these are
Yeah.
big guys, and anyway. So, and Marty tells me about Chu Shong Tin. He has a credibility, and in any event, so Chu Shong Tin would change his teaching style over the decades to try to get his students to be able to come closer to what he could do, and was never satisfied. He said he never really, you know, was that successful in his teaching as he wanted to be. Um, in the last 10 years or so of his life, he changed his teaching style again to emphasize Zamzong, the standing meditation work. And I started off doing that with his class and nothing but that. And then he reintroduced the forms in the Wing Chun system itself over like a 3-year period, spending 6 months on each part of it, to try to incorporate what he described as, and if you were to talk to some of the people that are currently teaching in the Chu Shong Tin lineage, people like Sifu Nima King, etc., Mindful Wing Chun. You know who they are?
I've seen their YouTube videos, Mindful Wing Chun.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's an example. If somebody like Nima or some others, they would use the description that they learned at Chu Shong Tin school back in the, from 2008 to his death, where he would describe it as, when you're standing straight, when you're doing your standing meditation practice, whatever you want to call it. The idea being to Taigong, raise up through the anus, raise up energy through the base of the spine to the crown of the head, to reach that part of the brain, the back of the brain that Chu Shong Tin would call the Nim Tao, the idea, and to be able to do all movements from that part of the brain, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the terminology and the verbal description that is commonly used now to describe the Chu Shong Tin method of training, at least in the latter years of his life, and what he was trying to develop in his students.
Well, I love that idea, the mind force idea,
Yes,
right?
yes. I have my own thoughts about that, and we can get to that whenever you want to. But so this was Chu Shong Tin's way of describing what he was doing, and his way of describing and utilizing his training methods to help his students try to develop those abilities, or what he called the Nim Tao state. Okay, and to have all movements stem from there, which theoretically would produce great power with very little muscular effort or tension, and therefore be less susceptible to resistance. So that when you're in contact with somebody, which of course is inevitable in any kind of altercation, then if you can move where you want to go, and their efforts to stop you or impede your progress is fruitless, that would be a pretty big advantage for you, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's a nice thing to say. It's a nice thing to think about or to presume. But in reality, how is that fucking possible? Okay. I mean, I don't care who you are. If you got somebody, regardless of size or strength, that are applying resistance to you, but especially if they're bigger and stronger than you, and they're not cooperating with you, and they're trying to stop you, you can think what you're doing is, oh, I'm using my mind or whatever, or I've got the Nim Tao state, or, don't use any effort, or relax and move from my center or whatever. But in reality, you're going to know right away how well you can pull that off. Okay. And that's one of the great values of Chi Sao, because it's constant contact with the partner, and you get that feedback immediately and constantly. So, you can still lie to yourself about what you're doing, but if you've got any semblance of self-honesty, which is crucial if you're going to improve in the martial arts or in anything else, in my opinion, then you're going to know right away how well what you're doing works or not. And then that can give you some sort of maybe guide to continue to improve, or where your practice should be headed. There aren't a lot of people that I've met and touched hands with that can pull that off, what I've just described. But there are some that can. And it's a very impressive thing. So I have my own ideas, of course, and my own training and development and my own teaching about specifically what that consists of and how to train it up and what's really behind those abilities. And it's nothing complex at all.